Dust and whispers. A rusty shriek preceded its arrival, the wagon groaning into Harmony Gulch like a wounded beast. A plume of ochre dust, mimicking parched earth, rose to briefly cloak the faded hues of the wagon's frame. Drawn by a mule whose drooping spine mirrored countless miles, its steps a listless drag against the dirt, the conveyance drew every eye. Martha, flour dusting her hands like a fresh snowfall, paused in the bakery doorway, squinting against the sun's harsh glare. Jebediah, knee-deep in the innards of a broken wheel by the livery, wiped grease across his apron, interest piqued. Even Silas, usually adrift in his own world on the porch of the general store, shaded his eyes with a weathered hand, his whittling momentarily forgotten. The wagon groaned to a standstill at the heart of the settlement, the mule exhaling a gusty sigh of relief. A woman, stiff from travel, dismounted. Sarah Miller. Her boots tapped the parched ground, releasing another small cloud, and then she reached into the wagon's depths. The sight of a small boy, his eyes wide pools of weariness, being lifted to the ground silenced the rising tide of murmurs from the onlookers. Sarah's face bore the deep furrows of exhaustion, a weariness that transcended physical strain. Billy, the boy, gripped her hand, his fingers digging into her palm in a silent plea for reassurance. Their clothes, relics of better days, whispered stories of arduous journeys. Sarah's dress, once a vibrant hue, was now a tapestry of patches and faded color, and Billy's trousers rode high above his dusty ankles. "Well, I'll be," Jebediah remarked, his voice cutting through the quiet. "Looks like company's come calling." Martha, ever the pragmatist, was first to extend a hand. "They look bone-tired and peckish. Someone fetch them water, and I'll bring out some loaves." A few townsfolk shifted, their initial curiosity mellowed by cautious compassion. Whispers snaked through the crowd, hushed and fragmented like wind through dry grass. "That's her, the Miller widow. Heard she was in a bad way. Lost everything to the bank, didn't she? And the boy, poor tykes, lost his pa, they say." Oblivious to the scrutiny, Sarah focused solely on Billy. Kneeling, she gently brushed a stray strand of hair from his brow. "You all right, love?" she murmured, her voice a soothing balm. He nodded, his eyes still wide and questioning, darting across the sea of faces. The water arrived first, a tin cup proffered by young Mary, the blacksmith's daughter. Sarah accepted it with a grateful inclination, letting Billy drink before taking her own measured sips. Then came the bread, still warm and redolent, devoured by mother and son with an urgency that underscored their famishment. "Thank you," Sarah rasped, her voice worn thin. "Your kindness is appreciated." The sheriff, a stout figure crowned by a walrus mustache, approached. "Mrs. Miller," he stated, his tone even. "Welcome to Harmony Gulch. We were expecting you." Sarah's gaze sharpened. "Were you?" "News travels on the wind," he replied, his eyes steady. "We pride ourselves on being hospitable, yet we also value order." "Order," Sarah echoed, a subtle edge to her tone. "Is that what you call it?" The sheriff disregarded the undercurrent. "We understand you might be seeking a place to settle. Opportunities are scarce here, but the people are generally decent. What are your intentions, Mrs. Miller?" Sarah straightened her posture, lifting her chin in defiance. "My intention is to care for my son by any means necessary." The murmurs escalated, now a blend of pity and suspicion. "She's flat broke. What's she going to do to make ends meet?" "Probably looking for charity." Old Silas, leaning heavily on his gnarled cane, shuffled closer. "Got metal, that one," he declared, his voice surprisingly robust. "See it in her eyes." The sheriff sighed, a puff of air that ruffled his mustache. "Well, Mrs. Miller, we'll see what can be managed. There's a dilapidated shack on the town's outskirts. It's not much, but it's a roof. You can stay there a spell, find your footing." Sarah hesitated, her pride wrestling with desperation's tug. She glanced at Billy, his face still wan and apprehensive, and made her choice. "Thank you," she whispered, the words barely audible. "We accept your offer." As they trailed the sheriff towards the ramshackle dwelling, the whispers continued to swirl around them, mimicking dust devils dancing on the plains. Whispers of conjecture, judgment, and apprehension. Yet, beneath the surface noise, a faint current stirred, a seed of hope, perhaps, or merely a reluctant respect for a woman who had lost everything, yet remained unbroken. The auction block. The air tasted of ozone and humiliation. Judgment's bitter tang, like chewing on metal, infused every breath. A swirling cloud of speculation threatened to choke Sarah and Billy as they stood on the platform. Usually, Jebediah's rickety stage showcased tractors or prize-winning hogs. This morning, however, the sweaty auctioneer introduced them as the Widow Miller and her boy, his voice booming across the expectant crowd. Jebediah mopped his forehead with a greasy rag. "Let's not squander daylight, folks. Here's a sturdy back and willing pair of hands ripe for honest work." What offers for a month's labor from Mrs. Miller and her son? A low rumble stirred the onlookers. Sarah's gaze remained locked on a flaw in the wooden planks, desperately trying to block out the prying stares, the murmurs. Billy, clutching her, plucked at her dress. "Mama, are they selling our horse?" Sarah squeezed his hand, knuckles aching. "No, sweetheart. We're finding someone to help." A lie acrid on her tongue, but she couldn't bear to witness his innocence shatter. From the crowd, a man sporting a walrus mustache and earth-stained overalls spat tobacco, a dark stain blooming in the dust. $5, he croaked. $5. Jebediah amplified, his voice resonating. "6? Do I hear 6 for a hard-working woman and a youngster already showing promise with chores?" Bids trickled in, laced with reluctance. Sarah felt the weight of their impoverishment, the explicit agreement that they were being bartered as solutions to another's manpower deficit, burdens to be shouldered for next to nothing. $10. 12. Each offer felt like a hot iron against her soul. A woman, face etched with worry and hands warped by toil, declared, 15. "But the boy minds my chickens." "No dawdling." Sarah's head shot up, grip tightening on Billy's hand. He winced. No dawdling, as if he were a stray to be collared. As if she were a defunct tool. A new voice, resonant and deep, sliced through the tension. $20. Sarah scanned the crowd, searching for the speaker. A man stood apart, face shadowed by his hat's brim. He was no local. Though worn, his garments spoke of better days, his bearing aristocratic. An outsider. The bidding hesitated. $20 was a considerable sum. Jebediah, sensing a profit, wrung his hands. $20. Going once, going twice, the walrus-mustached man muttered about city money. The chicken woman crossed her arms, lips compressed. $25, Sarah blurted. Barely a whisper, the words hung in the charged atmosphere. Heads swiveled in her direction. Surprise, confusion, even a hint of respect flickered across their faces. Jebediah sputtered. "Mrs. Miller? You can't bid on yourself, ma'am." "Why not?" Sarah's voice, still unsteady, gained resolve. "I'm worth more than $25. We both are." She met the stranger's gaze, an unspoken challenge burning within her. Sensing her resolve, Billy straightened his slight frame. He surveyed the staring faces, his fear slowly yielding to a fragile courage. The stranger touched the brim of his hat, a faint smile gracing his lips. $30. The stranger's bid. A communal intake of breath rippled through the throng as Sarah boldly declared her own name, the sound cutting through the auctioneer's monotonous drone. A palpable tension filled the air, thick with disbelief and a hesitant admiration. Little Billy, clinging to his mother's skirt, gazed upward, his young face alight with burgeoning hope. Then a subtle shift permeated the assembly. A figure emerged, a man, spare of frame, etched with the stories of sun and wind. His eyes the color of river-worn pebbles. He moved with a fluid grace, parting the observers as easily as a breeze through cattails. His clothes, plain but durable, spoke of countless hours spent beneath an open sky. One moment he was unseen, the next, undeniably present. Sarah hadn't noticed him before, yet the unwavering quality of his gaze, the near imperceptible inclination of his head, quelled the frantic bird beating against her ribs. The auctioneer, a stout man with a sheen of perspiration on his forehead, stammered, "Well now, that's certainly resourceful. 50 cents, then. Any further bids for Mrs. Miller and her son?" Silence stretched, taut and expectant. The townsfolk shuffled, their initial shock mellowing into a cautious curiosity. No one seemed willing to challenge a mother's fierce self-advocacy. It felt unseemly. Just as a fragile hope began to blossom in Sarah's chest, a gravelly voice shattered the quiet from the rear. 75 cents. Jedediah, the blacksmith, his face ruddy with drink, sported a predatory gleam in his eye. He'd long subjected Sarah to suggestive remarks, a habit amplified by Thomas's passing. Sarah's spirit sank. It had been a fool's dream. But before she could respond, the stranger stepped fully into the son's waning embrace. He raised a hand, a slow, deliberate gesture that commanded attention. $1, he stated, his voice a low, resonant timbre that carried effortlessly across the square. The blacksmith sputtered, his complexion darkening further. "Who in the devil are you?" The stranger didn't deign to look at him. His focus remained locked on Sarah, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Someone who values a just exchange. Just exchange. Jedediah scoffed, his voice dripping with scorn. "This ain't about justice, it's business. I bid $1.25." The auctioneer, sensing the rising stakes, wrung his hands, a predatory gleam sparking in his eyes. Do I hear more? $1.25, going once. Again, the stranger's hand rose. $2. A ripple of murmurs pulsed through the crowd. $2 was a considerable fortune, especially for a widow burdened with a child. What motive drove this man? Jedediah faltered, his bravado momentarily punctured. Desire burned, but $2 strained his limits. He scanned the faces of the others, seeking camaraderie, finding only a blend of wonder and fascination. $2 going once, the auctioneer intoned, his voice thick with anticipation. Going twice. Jedediah, fueled by a mixture of wounded pride and raw lust, refused to yield. $2.50. The stranger remained unmoved. $3. A collective gasp. $3. Unprecedented. Jedediah's face crumbled. He knew he'd reached his limit. He couldn't justify such an expense, not even for her. He spat on the parched earth and stalked away, muttering curses under his breath. The auctioneer, his voice trembling with undisguised glee, slammed the gavel with resounding force. Sold. To the gentleman for $3. All eyes converged on the stranger, who finally swept his gaze from Sarah to the assembled townsfolk. A faint, almost apologetic smile touched his lips. Name's Caleb Stone. Sarah simply stared, rendered speechless. Caleb Stone, a name that resonated with strength and reliability, mirroring the man before her. He had purchased her and her son. Yet, in his eyes, she detected no malice, no predatory hunger, only compassion? And something else, something just beyond her grasp. Billy, emboldened by the stranger's intervention, tugged insistently on Sarah's sleeve. Mama, who is he? Sarah didn't know, but she sensed her life and Billy's had veered onto an unforeseen path. A path that, perhaps, might lead them from the shadows into the light. An unexpected home. The hammer fell. $3. The word echoed in the stunned silence that followed, bouncing off the rough-hewn walls of the auction hall. Jedediah's face, a roadmap of fury and thwarted desire, was almost comical. Almost. Sarah still felt the tremor in her hands, the phantom weight of Jedediah's gaze like a brand on her skin. Caleb Stone hadn't moved, hadn't even blinked. He simply stood there, a granite statue amidst the swirling dust and murmuring crowd. Then he inclined his head slightly towards the auctioneer, a silent acknowledgement of his victory. Well, Mr. Stone, it seems you've acquired yourself a family, the auctioneer announced, his voice laced with thinly veiled curiosity. He mopped his brow with a greasy rag. Papers need signin', then they're yours. Sarah could only stare. $3. She and Billy, her entire life, reduced to that paltry sum. Yet it wasn't the price that stung, but the utter lack of control. She was a pawn traded between men. Billy, however, seemed more confused than afraid. He tugged on her skirt, his small voice barely audible above the shuffling feet and whispered conversations. Mama, are we going with him? He gestured towards Caleb with a hesitant nod. Sarah squeezed his hand. I don't know, baby. Caleb approached, his boots silent on the packed earth floor. He carried himself with a quiet confidence that both intrigued and unnerved her. Come, he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the air. Let's get you both away from this place. He led them outside, away from the oppressive atmosphere of the auction hall and into the crisp afternoon air. A simple wagon waited, pulled by a sturdy-looking mare. Caleb helped Billy up onto the seat, then turned to Sarah, offering his hand. She hesitated, then took it, her calloused palm meeting his surprisingly warm one. The ride was silent. Sarah watched Caleb, trying to decipher the man behind the impassive mask. He didn't offer explanations, didn't make small talk. He simply drove, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. Billy, exhausted from the day's ordeal, soon fell asleep, his head resting against Sarah's side. After what felt like an eternity, the wagon turned off the main road and onto a narrow, overgrown path. The trees closed in around them, their branches forming a leafy canopy overhead. Sarah held her breath, her anxiety growing with each passing moment. Where was he taking them? Finally, the trees parted, revealing a small cottage nestled in a clearing. Smoke curled invitingly from the chimney, and the windows glowed with a warm, golden light. It was small, but undeniably welcoming. Caleb stopped the wagon and hopped down. He walked to the cottage door and pushed it open, gesturing for Sarah and Billy to enter. This is where we'll be staying? Sarah asked, her voice filled with disbelief. For now, Caleb replied, his expression unreadable. Sarah stepped inside, her eyes widening in surprise. The cottage was small but impeccably clean and well-furnished. A fire crackled merrily in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. A small table was set for two with steaming bowls of stew and freshly baked bread. I don't understand, Sarah stammered, her mind reeling. Why would you do this? Caleb turned to face her, his gaze direct and unwavering. You needed a place to go. I provided one. He paused, then added, eat. Rest. We can talk in the morning. He turned and left, closing the door behind him, leaving Sarah alone with her sleeping son and 1,000 unanswered questions. She looked around the cozy cottage, a wave of conflicting emotions washing over her. Relief, gratitude, suspicion, fear. It was all too much to process. She gently woke Billy and coaxed him to eat a few bites of the stew. He was too tired to ask questions, content to simply snuggle against her side. As she watched him drift back to sleep, Sarah couldn't help but wonder what tomorrow would bring. This unexpected haven felt like a dream, too good to be true. And deep down, she suspected that the price for this kindness would be far greater than $3. Whispers in the wind. The wind, usually a comforting presence rustling through the tall grasses surrounding the cottage, now seemed to carry whispers. Sarah, hanging clothes on the line behind the house, could almost discern words carried on the breeze, words about her, about Caleb. She knew Harmony Gulch wouldn't let the events of yesterday fade quietly into the sunset. She wrung out a small shirt, Billy's. He was inside, sketching furiously with a piece of charcoal Caleb had given him. The small act of kindness had warmed Sarah, but hadn't melted the ice of suspicion around her heart. $3. She was worth $3, and Caleb had paid it. A distant clatter of wagon wheels drew her attention. A farm wagon, piled high with hay, rumbled down the road that ran parallel to Caleb's land. Two women, their faces obscured by wide-brimmed bonnets, sat on the driver's seat. Sarah could hear their voices, though not their words. As the wagon passed, one of the women leaned forward, peering intently at the cottage. Sarah straightened, meeting her gaze. The woman quickly looked away, nudging her companion and muttering something. Sarah's stomach tightened. She knew what they were saying. That's her. The one Caleb Stone bought. She could practically hear the judgment in their tones. Later that day, as she swept the porch, she saw a group of men gathered outside the general store in the distance. They were gesturing, their movements animated. Though she couldn't make out their faces, she recognized Jedediah's bulk amongst them. He was undoubtedly the loudest, his voice booming even at that distance. Sarah's grip tightened on the broom handle. Caleb remained an enigma. He worked silently in his fields, tilling the soil with a steady, unwavering rhythm. He ate his meals with quiet deliberation, offering her polite smiles but revealing nothing of his thoughts. He was a ghost in his own home, present but untouchable. That evening, as Billy slept soundly in his small bed, Sarah found Caleb sitting on the porch, whittling a piece of wood. The setting sun cast long shadows, painting the scene in hues of orange and purple. The townspeople, she began, her voice hesitant. They're talking. Caleb didn't look up. He continued to shave thin curls of wood from the block in his hand. Gossip is a currency in a small town, Sarah. It buys attention, sells stories. But about us? About why you? She trailed off, unable to voice the question that haunted her. He finally raised his eyes, his gaze meeting hers. His eyes were the color of weathered stone, deep and unreadable. I needed help on the farm. You and Billy needed a place to stay. It was a practical arrangement. His words were simple, logical, but they didn't ring true. Not entirely. And what do you expect in return? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. He paused, his gaze drifting towards the horizon. The wind picked up, swirling around them, carrying the faint scent of rain. Honest work. And perhaps a little peace. He looked back at her, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Is that so much to ask? Sarah didn't answer. The wind howled, a mournful cry that seemed to echo her own uncertainty. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that the price of Caleb's generosity would be far more than she could ever imagine. And she was already paying it. Kindness takes root. The days that followed the auction bled into a rhythm of hard work and quiet observation. Caleb set Sarah to tasks she could manage in her condition, mending fences where the wire was low, tending the small kitchen garden, and keeping the cottage clean. Billy, initially wary, shadowed Caleb, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. One afternoon, Sarah watched from the porch as Caleb sat with Billy beneath the sprawling oak tree. Caleb had pulled a worn book from his saddlebag, its pages dog-eared and faded. He pointed to the words, his voice a low murmur that carried on the gentle breeze. Billy, perched on the edge of his seat, repeated the sounds, his brow furrowed in concentration. It was a reading lesson. A warmth spread through Sarah, surprising her. She'd been so focused on the potential threat Caleb posed, she'd almost forgotten Billy's education. Her husband, Thomas, had promised to teach him, but life had intervened. Seeing Caleb patiently guiding Billy, her son's face alight with accomplishment, eased some of the tightness in her chest. Later that evening, after Billy had drifted off to sleep, Sarah found Caleb splitting wood near the barn. The rhythmic thud of the axe echoed in the twilight. She hesitated, then walked towards him. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "For teaching Billy." Caleb paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. "He's a bright boy. Deserves a chance." He didn't meet her gaze, instead focusing on the next log. "He misses his pa." The words slipped out raw and painful. Caleb nodded, his silence a strange form of understanding. Losing someone leaves a hole. Sarah shivered despite the warmth of the evening. He seemed to be speaking from experience. The following weeks saw a subtle shift in their dynamic. Caleb remained reserved, but his actions spoke louder than his words. He brought Sarah lengths of soft flannel from the general store in Harmony Gulch, suggesting she start sewing baby clothes. He spent an afternoon reinforcing the floorboards in the small room that would become the nursery. He even started leaving small wildflowers on the windowsill each morning, a gesture that made Sarah's heart flutter with a confusing mix of gratitude and suspicion. One day, Sarah was struggling to reach a jar of preserved peaches on a high shelf. Her balance felt precarious, her belly heavy with child. Caleb appeared silently behind her, his presence startling her. "Let me," he said, his voice gruff but gentle. He effortlessly reached the jar and handed it to her. As he did, his fingers brushed against hers. A jolt, unexpected and unsettling, shot through her. She quickly averted her eyes, her cheeks flushed. "Thank you," she repeated, feeling flustered. "You need to be careful," Caleb said, his gaze lingering on her face. "Don't want you hurting yourself." His concern felt genuine, and for the first time, Sarah allowed herself to consider the possibility that Caleb's motives weren't entirely self-serving. Perhaps, just perhaps, kindness could take root in even the most barren soil. Perhaps she had misjudged him. That night, as she lay in bed, listening to the chirping of crickets, Sarah clutched the worn book Caleb used to teach Billy to her chest. It smelled of dust and leather and something else, something faintly reminiscent of Caleb himself, wood smoke and earth. She opened the book, tracing the letters with her finger. She still didn't understand his reasons for saving her, but the fear that had gripped her since the auction had begun to loosen its hold. A fragile hope, like a seedling pushing through cracked earth, began to bloom. The thirsty land. The dust devils danced with a cruel glee Sarah found unsettling. They hadn't been a playful curiosity before, but a mocking reminder of the dwindling creek and the browning fields. Harmony Gulch was thirsty. Each day felt hotter than the last. The air hung heavy, thick with the scent of parched earth and the unspoken fear that clung to the townsfolk like the dust on their worn boots. Even Billy, usually buzzing with boundless energy, moved with a languid reluctance, his laughter replaced by a persistent cough brought on by the grit in the air. Caleb's garden, once a vibrant splash of color against the muted landscape, was now a battlefield of drooping leaves and cracked soil. Sarah watched as he knelt each morning, his broad back a study in determined resilience, coaxing water from the well, bucket by precious bucket. He spoke to the plants in low, soothing tones, a language she couldn't understand, but one that seemed born of a deep connection to the land. Despite his efforts, the tomatoes withered on the vine, and the lettuce curled at the edges, turning brittle and brown. One afternoon, Sarah ventured out to the general store. The usual boisterous chatter was muted, replaced by hushed conversations and anxious glances. Old Man Hemlock, usually jovial behind the counter, wore a grim expression. The shelves, once overflowing, were becoming sparse. "It's bad, Sarah," Hemlock said, his voice raspy. "Real bad. Some folks are talking about leaving. Packing up what they can and heading west, hoping for greener pastures." Sarah's heart clenched. The thought of leaving, of uprooting Billy again, filled her with a despair she couldn't voice. She had barely begun to build a life here, a fragile foundation upon which to anchor her son's future. As she turned to leave, she overheard a group of men arguing near the water trough. Their voices, laced with frustration and desperation, carried on the wind. "Stone's got water," one man spat, his words thick with resentment. "He's got that well of his. He ain't sharing. He's got a right to it," another countered, though his tone lacked conviction. "It's his land." "Rights don't mean much when everyone's dying of thirst," the first man snarled. Sarah felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She knew Caleb. He wasn't a man to hoard resources. But she also understood the desperation that gripped the town. Water was life, and without it they were all doomed. Later that evening, as Caleb sat on the porch mending a tear in Billy's trousers, Sarah approached him. "I heard some talk in town," she began hesitantly. "About the well?" Caleb's hand stilled. He looked up at her, his eyes unreadable in the fading light. "They're saying you're not sharing," she continued, her voice barely a whisper. He sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of the parched land itself. "I am sharing, Sarah," he said quietly. "I've been letting folks fill their buckets at night when no one's looking. But it's not enough. The well's running low too. It won't last much longer if everyone starts drawing from it openly." "Then what will we do?" Sarah asked, her voice laced with fear. Caleb looked out at the darkening fields, his gaze distant. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely audible above the chirping of the crickets. "But I'll figure something out. I always do." Sharing the last drop. The well pulley groaned, its complaint echoing in the stark quiet of dawn as Caleb lowered the bucket. From the porch, Sarah watched, Billy glued to her side, his small hand gripping her skirt. The sun, a scorching brand in the heavens, baked the cracked earth. "Is Pa giving away all our water, Ma?" Billy's voice trembled. Sarah stroked his hair, a comforting gesture. "He's sharing, sweetheart. A kindness." Yet, the word felt flimsy, inadequate even to her. Caleb's muscles strained as he hoisted the brimming bucket, the water gleaming like a captured moon. He emptied it into a rough-hewn trough beyond his gate, where a queue of townsfolk had already materialized, their faces mirroring a blend of longing and resignation. Martha Olson, her visage a roadmap of sun-baked wrinkles, took her turn first. She dipped a small pail, her gratitude a silent nod. Next, old Mr. Abernathy shuffled forward, his breathing raspy, clutching a dented canteen. A faint smile flickered across his lips as he met Caleb's gaze. As the hours drifted by, the line stretched. Mothers with infants, men lugging empty casks, even stray dogs lapped at the spilled drops. Sarah noticed the shadow of concern darkening Caleb's features, a marked change from his usual calm resolve. With each bucket lifted, a fraction of their precious reserve vanished, a tangible loss. A dust cloud billowed, announcing the arrival of Jebediah Blackwood, the Gulch's most powerful rancher. He halted his lathered chestnut mare, his expression like a gathering storm. He bypassed the line, ignoring the others entirely. "Stone," he boomed, his voice cutting through the dry air like a whip. "What in tarnation do you think you're doing?" Caleb calmly filled a child's container, his movements precise. "Sharing our bounty, Blackwood." "Sharing? You're sabotaging this whole community. Think your trickle of a well is a solution? You're merely postponing the inevitable reckoning." Blackwood spat a dark stream onto the barren ground. "Let the desert claim the weak. Only the strong deserve to survive." A ripple of unease passed through the waiting crowd. Heads bowed, glances darted. Sarah squeezed Billy's hand tighter, a protective gesture. "Maybe," Caleb replied, finally meeting Blackwood's glare, his voice measured. "But I prefer to give the weak a fighting chance." "Help?" Blackwood scoffed, a grating, unpleasant sound. "You're currying favor, plain and simple." "What's the angle, Stone? What's your play?" Caleb offered no reply, his gaze steady, unyielding. The silence thickened, heavy with unspoken tension. "Remember my words, Stone," Blackwood warned, his eyes narrowed to slits. "This ain't altruism. There's an ulterior motive here, and I intend to expose it." He kicked his mare into motion, leaving behind a vortex of dust and bitter resentment. The line faltered, a few abandoning their containers and scurrying away. The remaining faces were clouded with apprehension. The air vibrated with suspicion and disquiet. Later, as the sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in shades of fire and ash, Sarah found Caleb alone on the porch, his gaze fixed on the desolate fields. "Blackwood's words," she murmured. "They instilled fear." Caleb sighed, raking his fingers through his hair. "He speaks a harsh truth. The spring is finite. The solace is only temporary." "Then why?" Sarah questioned softly. "Why deplete it at all?" He turned to her, his eyes holding a weariness that mirrored her own. "Because even temporary solace can be the difference between succumbing to despair and clinging to hope. And hope sometimes is all that sustains us." He paused, his voice dropping to a whisper. "And because I vowed to you I'd find a way." Accusations in the dust. Dust devils danced like tormented spirits, stirred by the cattle mob. Blackwood drove hard through Harmony Gulch. But the grit wasn't the only irritant. Blackwood, a scowl carved into his features, led the charge, his voice a harsh rasp against the stillness. "Stone," he hollered, yanking his horse to a standstill before Caleb's store. "Face your reckoning." A tremor ran through Sarah, inside the store assisting Caleb. Her hand instinctively cradled her belly, where Billy lay safe. Jaw clenched, Caleb emerged onto the porch, sunlight flashing off his belt buckle's aged metal. "What's the meaning of this, Blackwood?" he inquired, a calm counterpoint to the rancher's rage. "You know damn well. You're bleeding the river dry, Stone. Stealing water and leaving honest folk like myself parched and beggared." Blackwood spat, the projectile landing a scant distance from Caleb's boots. Drawn by the ruckus, the townsfolk coalesced, their countenances a study in apprehension. In Harmony Gulch, water equaled survival. Accusations of theft carried the weight of murder. "I'm sharing what I can," Caleb responded, his gaze unwavering. "My well still yields, and I won't stand by while my neighbors suffer." "Sharing?" Blackwood sneered. "Or buying goodwill? Hoping to cultivate some saintly image? Rumors reach me, Stone. Whispers about how you acquired a certain widow and her boy. What else did you barter for, Stone? Allegiance? Muted tongues?" A flush crept up Sarah's neck. The undercurrents of gossip were growing stronger, sharper. She loathed being a spectacle, a mere piece in someone else's game. "That's enough," Caleb cautioned, his tone sharpening. "You overstep." But the venom had seeped in. Onlookers, formerly curious, now wore expressions of hardened suspicion. Blackwood's words had found purchase in their anxieties. "He speaks truth," a voice piped up from the rear. Martha Jenkins, her face hollow, her eyes ringed with fatigue. "My garden's barren. My children thirst. How does Stone possess water while we wither?" Others echoed her sentiment, their voices swelling into a chorus of censure. "Aye, Stone. Where does it all originate? Are you hoarding it selfishly? He has likely fouled the river." Caleb stood firm, his shoulders set square. "I poison nothing. My well runs deep, that is all. I'll share what I can spare, but I will neither be intimidated nor defamed." "Then prove it." Blackwood roared, jabbing a thick finger towards Caleb. "Show us this well. Let us witness the source of this abundance." The throng surged forward, their faces reflecting a desperate blend of hope and animosity. Sarah's grip tightened on the windowsill, her knuckles bone white. This transcended mere water. It was about long-held grievances, raw fear, about the smoldering prejudices Blackwood had expertly fanned. It was about Caleb and the unspoken authority he seemed to command in this arid, desperate community. Caleb surveyed the hostile faces, his expression a closed book. He knew that revealing the well wouldn't resolve anything. It would only inflame their suspicions, their envy. Yet he also knew he couldn't simply endure their wrath. He inhaled deeply, the dust coating his palate. "Very well," he declared, his voice slicing through the din, "I will display the well. But heed this, what you behold may defy your expectations." He turned and moved toward the rear of the store, the crowd trailing him like a hungry pack. Sarah watched them depart, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knew with a cold premonition that whatever Caleb was about to reveal would reshape everything. And she doubted if Harmony Gulch, Caleb, or even herself could withstand the resulting storm. A mother's plea. "He's not a thief," Sarah shouted, her voice cracking against the rising tide of the crowd's anger. Dust devils danced at the edge of the gathering, mirroring the turmoil in her own heart. She pushed her way to the front, Billy clinging to her skirt, his face pale. Caleb stood motionless, a granite sentinel against the storm of accusations. "He gave us water," she continued, her voice stronger this time, fueled by a desperate need to protect the man who, despite everything, had offered them succor. "He helped us when no one else would. He bought us our freedom." Blackwood scoffed, his face flushed crimson. "Freedom? You call trading one master for another freedom, Sarah? He's using you, just like he's using this town." Others echoed his sentiment. "He's got you bewitched, Sarah. Don't be a fool, woman." The words were like stones hurled at her, each one chipping away at her resolve. She ignored them, focusing on the faces in the crowd, searching for a flicker of reason, of understanding. She saw only fear, desperation, and a simmering resentment that had been brewing long before the drought. Caleb had become a lightning rod for their collective anxieties. "He showed me the spring," she said, her voice softer now, pleading. "He wasn't hoarding it. He was trying to protect it, to share it in a way that would help everyone." A woman with hollow cheeks and eyes that mirrored the parched earth spat on the ground. "Protect it for himself, more like. So he can control us all." Sarah felt a wave of despair wash over her. Her words were useless against the force of their collective paranoia. She could see it in their eyes, the hunger, the desperation, the willingness to believe the worst. "Please," she begged, her voice hoarse. "Just listen to him. He has a plan. He can help us all." A chorus of denials erupted, louder, more furious than before. Blackwood stepped forward, his face inches from hers. We don't need his help. We can take care of ourselves. He grabbed her arm, his grip tight. And we can take what's rightfully ours. Billy, who had been silent until now, tugged at Sarah's skirt. Mama, he whispered, his voice trembling. I remember another spring. Sarah knelt, her hand instinctively going to Billy's face. What spring, honey? He looked up at her, his eyes wide and earnest. Behind the old Miller place, before everything. Pa used to take me there. It was small, but it was always there, even when the creek dried up. A hush fell over the crowd, a momentary pause in the storm. Sarah looked at Billy, then back at the faces of the townspeople. Hope, fragile and tentative, flickered in her chest. Blackwood's grip tightened on her arm. Don't listen to the boy. He's confused, delirious from the heat. But Sarah saw a different expression on some of the faces in the crowd now, a glimmer of recognition, a faint stirring of hope. Some of the older townsfolk might remember it too. She stood up, straightening her shoulders. He's not confused, she said, her voice ringing with a newfound conviction. He's telling the truth. There's another spring. And we're going to find it. The hidden spring. The air pressed down like a humid blanket as Billy, emboldened by the surfacing memory, started toward the foothills. Sarah hastened to match his pace, her hand hovering protectively near his back. A throng of townsfolk, a sea of anxious faces, trailed behind, a silent chorus of yearning and doubt. Caleb, a vigilant sentinel, occupied the rear, his gaze constantly assessing the crowd. Are you certain, Billy? Sarah queried, her voice a fragile thread against the rustle of feet. It's been so long. Billy affirmed with a nod, his small fist clenched around a weathered stick unearthed near the barn. I know the rocks, Mama. And the funny tree. He gestured with his makeshift staff toward a huddle of pines sculpted by wind on the lower slopes. That way. They pressed onward, the silence punctuated by the hacking cough of an elder or the fretful cry of an infant. The ground ascended sharply, the path dwindling to a faint track. Sarah faltered, Caleb's hand appeared instantly, a steadying presence. A tremor traced her spine, a warmth defying the tense atmosphere. Thank you, she breathed, perhaps retracting her hand a fraction too quickly. He simply inclined his head, his slate-colored eyes holding hers for a fleeting heartbeat. Oblivious to the charged undercurrent, Billy forged ahead, his youthful zeal seemingly boundless. He guided them past jutting crags and through patches of prickly undergrowth, his determination unwavering. Worry needled at Sarah. What if the memory proved false? What if this was simply a child's invention? The consequences could be dire. At long last, Billy halted. There. He pointed to a slender fissure in the rock face, nearly obscured by wild grapevines. The funny tree is just beyond. The townsfolk surged forward, eyes widening at the sight, a gnarled oak, its limbs contorted into grotesque shapes by the unyielding winds. And behind it, a slender ribbon of water trickled down the stone. A collective sigh rushed through the assembly. A wave of relief almost buckled Sarah's knees. Billy was correct. Caleb shouldered his way through the throng, his gaze fixed on the nascent spring. He knelt, cupping his hands to drink. Then he scrutinized the surrounding terrain, his expression pensive. It's not much, he declared, his voice cutting through the hushed murmurs. But it's enough to matter. Rancher Johnson, his face ablaze with contrition, shuffled forward. A man of imposing stature, etched with the harsh lines of the land, he had been the most vocal detractor of Caleb's advice. I owe you an apology, Stone, he mumbled, his gaze fixed on his boots. We all do. Fear robbed us of our senses. Caleb offered no response, his face an impassive mask. He rose and walked away from the spring toward the periphery of the crowd. There's enough water here to sustain us for a while if we conserve it, Caleb continued. But it's a finite resource. We must discover how to replenish it. His gaze sought Sarah's, a silent conversation passing between them. Billy remembered this place. Perhaps other sources exist, lying dormant, forgotten. Sarah looked at her son, standing tall beside the shimmering water. He was more than just a boy, he was a spark of hope in their darkening world. And in that instant, she realized she could place her trust in Caleb Stone, not only with her future, but with her very soul. The parched earth had brought them to this juncture, forging a connection in the crucible of fear and need. Now, their task was to cultivate something resilient, something vital, from the ruins of their former lives. Hope's arrival. The labor pains started subtly, a tightening that Sarah initially dismissed as another ache from the weeks of hauling buckets and worrying over the spring. But as the sun dipped below the Harmony Gulch horizon, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and fading gold, the contractions intensified, each one a relentless wave crashing over her. Caleb, ever observant, saw the flicker of discomfort in her eyes as they shared supper. He rose, his movements swift and decisive. It's time, he stated. more a confirmation than a question. He'd prepared everything weeks ago, transforming a small room off the main cottage into a birthing space. Clean linens, soft blankets, and the scent of lavender filled the air, a stark contrast to the dust and desperation that had permeated their lives. Billy, wide-eyed with a mixture of excitement and apprehension, clung to Caleb's hand. He'd never witnessed a birth before, but Caleb's calm demeanor seemed to reassure him. "I'll stay with you, Mama," he whispered, his small hand finding hers. The night unfolded slowly, each hour marked by Sarah's rising pain and Caleb's unwavering support. He was a quiet presence, offering sips of water, cool cloths for her forehead, and words of encouragement spoken in a low, soothing voice. He knew his place, a steady anchor in the storm raging within her. He was not a doctor nor a midwife, but he was attentive, respectful, and clearly deeply invested. Billy, initially hesitant, proved to be a surprising comfort. He fetched water, held Sarah's hand, and even attempted to tell her stories, his voice trembling with the effort to be brave. He was growing up, forced to mature by the harsh realities they faced, but tonight, a new kind of strength was born within him. As dawn approached, a new cry pierced the air, a small, insistent sound that filled the cottage with hope. A baby girl. Caleb gently cleaned the infant, his large hands surprisingly delicate as he wrapped her in a soft blanket. He placed her in Sarah's arms, and a wave of exhaustion and overwhelming love washed over her. She looked up at Caleb, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Hope," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Her name is Hope." Caleb smiled, a genuine, unguarded expression that transformed his face. He brushed a stray strand of hair from her forehead. "A good name," he said softly. The following days were a blur of nursing, sleeping, and adjusting to the newest member of their family. Billy took to his little sister immediately, his initial apprehension replaced by a fierce protectiveness. He would sit for hours watching her sleep, his small fingers gently stroking her cheek. He even gifted her his most prized possession, a small, worn wooden horse he had carved himself. The news of Hope's birth spread through Harmony Gulch like wildfire. It was a symbol, a sign of renewal in the face of despair. Folks who had ostracized Caleb now came to the cottage, bearing gifts of milk, eggs, and hand-knitted blankets. Even Rancher Johnson, his gruff exterior softened by the sight of the tiny infant, offered his congratulations and a promise of assistance. One evening, as the sun set, casting long shadows across the valley, Sarah sat on the porch with Caleb, Hope nestled in her arms. Billy was inside, humming a lullaby to his sister. The air was still dry, the drought still lingered, but there was a sense of optimism, a belief that things would get better. "Thank you, Caleb," Sarah said quietly, her voice filled with emotion. "For everything." He looked at her, his gaze intense. "We did it together, Sarah," he replied, his voice low. "We're a family now." As Hope stirred in her arms, Sarah knew he was right. They were a family, bound together by hardship, love, and the shared hope for a better future. The road ahead would undoubtedly be challenging, but with Caleb by her side and with Hope in her arms, Sarah felt ready to face whatever came their way. The baby's birth had breathed new life into them all, a fresh start that had seemed impossibly distant only months before. Harmony Gulch and their little family had been given a second chance. And her name was Hope. A new harmony. The dust swirled around Jebediah's boots as he approached the porch. He looked older, somehow, the lines around his eyes etched deeper than Sarah remembered. He shifted his weight, his gaze fixed on the worn planks at his feet. Hope, nestled in Sarah's arms, stirred slightly, her tiny fingers grasping at Sarah's blouse. "Sarah," he finally mumbled, his voice raspy from disuse and the ever-present dust. I owe you an apology. To Caleb, too." He risked a glance up, meeting Sarah's wary gaze. "We were wrong. Blinded by fear and, well, prejudice." Sarah didn't speak, letting him continue. "The well on my north pasture dried up completely this morning. Bone dry. Never happened before. Then I heard about the spring Caleb found, the one he's been sharing. We acted rashly, accused him of things we didn't understand." Jebediah swallowed hard. "Truth is, we were scared. Scared of losing everything." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a crumpled piece of paper. "We took a vote down at the mercantile. Everyone agreed. We want to help Caleb with the spring. Offer our labor, our resources. Anything to make it work for everyone." He extended the paper towards her. Sarah didn't take it. "Why now, Jebediah? After everything?" He looked down at his boots again. "Hope, your little girl. Seeing her born, it reminded us what's important. That we're all in this together. And Caleb, Well, he didn't turn us away even when we treated him like dirt. Billy, who had been unusually quiet, stepped forward. He saved my pony, he said, his voice clear and surprisingly firm. He didn't have to, but he did. A small smile touched Sarah's lips. He has a way of doing that, doesn't he? She looked at Caleb, who stood silently by the door, his expression unreadable. He nodded almost imperceptibly. We understand if you don't trust us, Jebediah continued, his voice laced with humility. But we're hoping you'll give us a chance to make things right. Sarah considered his words, the sincerity in his eyes. The drought wasn't just affecting her, it was strangling the entire community. And Hope deserved to grow up in a place where people looked out for each other, not against each other. All right, Jebediah, she said finally. We accept your apology. And your help. A collective sigh of relief seemed to sweep through the small crowd that had gathered behind Jebediah. Murmurs of agreement and gratitude rippled through the air. The following days were a blur of activity. Men and women worked side by side, reinforcing the spring, digging irrigation ditches, and rationing water. The initial distrust slowly dissolved, replaced by a shared sense of purpose. Caleb, with his knowledge of the land and his quiet determination, became a leader, guiding the community with a gentle hand. Sarah watched it all unfold, a sense of peace settling over her. She saw children laughing as they splashed in the newly diverted water, women sharing stories and recipes, and men working together with a newfound camaraderie. Hope, cradled in her arms, seemed to absorb the positive energy, her small face serene. The drought persisted, but the spirit of Harmony Gulch had been renewed. They learned to conserve, to share, and to rely on one another. The fear that had once gripped them was replaced by a resilient hope, fueled by the birth of a baby and the quiet strength of a man they had once misjudged. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Sarah sat on the porch with Caleb. Hope slept peacefully in her cradle nearby. They're calling it the miracle of Harmony Gulch, Sarah said, a smile playing on her lips. They say hope brought us all together. Caleb reached for her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. She did bring us together, he agreed. But it was more than that. It was about finding the strength to forgive, to trust, and to believe in each other. He looked out at the transformed town, the flickering lights of homes scattered across the valley. This is a new harmony, Sarah. A better one. And as Sarah gazed at Caleb, at Billy playing contentedly with a wooden horse he had carved, and at the small bundle of hope sleeping soundly in her cradle, she knew he was right. Harmony Gulch had found its way back to harmony, not through luck or chance, but through the enduring power of compassion and the unwavering belief in a brighter future.